In the past few decades, more women have found the path to the C-suite and even to the premier's office. And yet, that 50% of the population is still vastly underrepresented in the boardrooms of the country. And so far in Canada, no female premier has been reelected to a second term. What's going to change that? Let's ask. Sylvia Bashevkin, a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, and most recently the editor of Doing Politics Differently, Women Premiers in Canada's Provinces and Territories. And Colleen Moorhead, Chief Client Officer at the law firm Osler and editor of The Collective Wisdom of High-Performing Women, Leadership Lessons from the Judy Project. Hi to you both.
Hello.
Could I just say you both look very fabulous?
Thank
I love
you.
the pink.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to learning from both of you. Colleen, let's get started with you. Your book highlights the work of the Judy Project. What does the Judy Project do?
So the Judy Project was created in memory or recognition of a woman, Judy Elder, who was at Microsoft and a phenomenal leader. Mm-hmm. And
what made her so special?
You know, she did a speech at WXN 3 weeks before she passed, and she talked about, you know, collective ambition and the whole concept of being ambitious for your team, your company, and it was really, really amazing. Mm-hmm. And then she passed, and for all of us,
she was pretty young, right?
She was 47 years old. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing is that we all felt, working in the workforce, that she had a voice that we wanted to maintain. Mm-hmm. So we created a leadership program for women reaching the C-suite in 2003, and it has been running every year ever since.
And what do you think Judy's lasting legacy is?
I think the concept of value-based leadership, mm-hmm. and also that it's okay to be ambitious, and this collective form of ambition mm-hmm. is really valuable to our Canadian companies. I think ultimately we just want to make Canadian companies stronger.
And speaking from a business point of view to politics, you've written about premiers, female premiers across the country, the ones that are there and the lack of. Do you find that women are ambitious to reach that level of being in that executive position in government?
Well, the research on women in politics shows that on average, when women become legislators, they're often more focused on serving their local constituency and less on moving up within their parties or moving up to an executive cabinet position, for example.
What is the research? Why is that?
Well, they tend to have a background in community leadership. Perhaps they were at the forefront of getting a crossing guard in the school district where their kids go to school. Or maybe they were working very hard to save a local hospital. In other words, they begin often with a focus on community leadership, which leads them into public life. The women that we studied in this book, and I worked with a group of about 12 colleagues across the country on the Women Premiers Project, we find that a lot of these women are moving up within their political parties, perhaps at times when the parties are in difficult circumstances, mm-hmm. and the parties are in need of a leader who can give a completely new image to the party. And because very few people are going to confuse a man who's leaving with a woman coming in many cases, those are the circumstances in which women move up. But certainly women premiers are ambitious and they're confident because they wouldn't get to this point of executive leadership in our political system if they didn't have those attributes.
But if they're coming in a situation where, I guess, change is needed, if they do well, fantastic. But if they don't do well, what does that say about women in that level of government?
Well, I think one of the arguments that we make in the book is it's not necessarily how well they do, it's often the image and the expectations and perceptions that we bring as analysts and voters to their contributions. I mean, a lot of these women have done extremely well. They've won majority governments for their parties. They've really moved their parties forward. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the people in their parties are very patient when things start to come apart a bit. And we argue that the level of impatience with women leaders is considerably greater, including within their own parties, than it is for men who may have a few mistakes on the way.
Well, when I was reading the book, my eyebrows kind of shot up at this part. And in the book, you ask, is the concept of leadership itself masculine? And what did you find the answer to be?
Well, certainly the ideas that we carry around about leadership as a commanding style as opposed to a consensus-seeking style is quite intriguing, because often political parties and we as voters say we need somebody who's going to listen more. And then when we get someone who's listening more, we say, well, the person's weak and vacillating and can't make a decision. So I think that there are very differing understandings that we carry around at the same time about what leadership means. And I think if we do want more consensus-based and collective leadership that's less about the individual and more about the team, then maybe we need to become a little more patient with the processes that are involved in getting consensus.
And Colleen, how does that play out in the corporate world?
Well, I mean, I think corporations represent Canadians, and Canadians are diverse and 50% female. So I think organizations are very much like Canada is. And so consensus-based is far more important than it would have been in what I'd call the heroic leadership model. So where someone tells you what to do versus listens. And I think we want to retain our millennials and keep them engaged in our companies, that type of leadership, the consensus-based leadership style, is far more important, as is the characteristics that we talk about in the book, which is authenticity, courage, tenacity. Those are human characteristics, and they're also leadership characteristics.
Well, let's take a look at a picture of what it looks like across the country, both in politics and in the boardroom. Women hold only 27% of the seats in the House of Commons. There have been 12 female first ministers in Canada. None have won more than one election. Women make up just 19.5% of the board members for Canada's top 500 companies. 109 of the 500 have no female board members. Only 8.5% of the highest paid positions in Canada's top 100 listed companies are held by women. Women hold only 25% of vice president positions and 15% of CEO positions. I'm kind of feeling depressed. When you hear all those numbers, honestly, what emotion do you feel, Sylvia?
Well, certainly looking at the position of women premiers and prime ministers, we know we've had one woman first minister at the federal level. We've had 11 provincially for a total of 12 first ministers. We have none at the moment. I think I try and look at the current situation as inspiring for action, because there's certainly no basis for suggesting that there's no problem if women represent more than half the population and we have no women in positions of political executive leadership
But
right now.
representation matters, right?
It certainly
so
does.
if you don't see yourself, how can you actually see yourself in that position?
Well, I think it's about having, political parties and we as citizens who vote to actually pressure our political parties to start doing more, to recruit more women, and to offer cabinet positions that are actually pathways towards power. Because historically we find a lot of women who do get into cabinet positions in our political executives are clustered in the less prestigious portfolios. We've had very few women, for example, who've been finance ministers, very few who've been foreign affairs ministers. These high, sort of high cachet positions are the ones that we need to see more opportunities opening up for women, because those are the ones that generally lead to the political C-suite, let's call it.
Well, looking at that board that I just talked about, all those different numbers, Colleen, what is your emotion?
Well, I think I'm optimistic. I think the climate is changing. I think that we're seeing legislation like the 30%, comply or explain for public companies. I think large public companies, men and women in leadership roles, are taking the issue of diversity very seriously. And I also just think that the climate in the workforce is changing. Young people want a different environment. They are not that interested, and maybe that's because we raised them, but they are not into command and control. They want to be consulted. They want to be engaged. And I think that a woman's leadership style actually supports that and produces a warmer place to work.
Well, I want to go. I want to come back to a women's leadership style.
Yeah.
But when we have this conversation, the usual rebuttal is that yes, there are qualified women out there, but leaders should be chosen based solely on merit. Is it possible to see a 50% gender divide and still base it entirely on merit? Sylvia.
Well, I think merit's very much in the eyes of the beholder. right? I mean, people have various understandings of what constitutes merit. It's often linked to fit in an organization. And if the organization is one which is historically not terribly open to women, then I think, merit and fit and so on get tied up in a package that's not necessarily very welcoming. So I begin with the question of, how political parties are recruiting candidates, and in fact, how we are treating the candidates who are out there. So one of the concerns coming out of this study about women premiers is the fact that we have had 2 women premiers recently, both in Ontario, Kathleen Wynne, and Alberta, Rachel Notley, who've been the recipients of more threats against their personal safety than any of the previous premiers in the jurisdictions of Ontario and Alberta.
That's frightening, and that's mostly through social media, right?
A lot of it is through social media. And so my point here is about, can we actually attract people to a public sphere in which, particularly for progressive women, and in the case of Kathleen Wynne, as a sexual orientation minority, the extent to which we can actually expect people from diverse backgrounds to put themselves and their families at the eye of that sort of storm. And so to me, the questions of merit are linked in with this point about our welcoming perspective towards diverse people in positions of public leadership. Because as much as parties might try to recruit, there's also the need for a supply. In other words, people who are prepared to be recruited. And so one of the concerns is, with social media, have we unleashed a storm that makes it very unwelcoming, aside from all the historic problems, that adds more problems? Because we know social media is very visually focused. And so the emphasis on women's appearance and speaking style, their family lives, all of the stuff that gets peeled off the onion sort of in social media. One of the questions is whether this is a fair sort of a recruiting ground for women candidates.
And Colleen, what do you think? Is it possible to see a 50% gender divide and still based it entirely on merit?
Absolutely. I mean, I think organizations can use their diversity as a recruitment tool. Like, I think the book leads, if I can see one, I can be one. And I think that's really true when women think about joining an organization, and talent is capital. I think they look at an organization and say, how hospitable is it here? Are there senior women in leadership roles? Can I bring my whole self to work? And am I allowed to lead with the style I have? So yes, does that mean occasionally you need to ensure in your recruitment you're carrying a diverse slate? Does it mean that in your organization you have to recognize there's different ways to lead, not just one way? And then in retention, can you provide benefits and support to women and men equally, without them having to ask? Because if I'm socialized to not necessarily ask for my raise, should I not get it because I'm a female?
I'm just trying to figure out, because I feel like I need to push back a little bit, because I know we've been talking about the numbers and what the numbers show, and we've also talked about the lack of the people in the decision-making roles. So if you are leaving this responsibility to companies, and maybe what you see is what you become, if you don't already have those people at the company, then how do you even recruit those people in the first place? So do you think that to avoid all of that, we should be using gender-based targets to recruit people into companies?
So I think there's a difference between a target and a quota. And I think there is too much research out there that says that companies that are diverse outperform. There's lots of research on that. And so I think it really goes back to, I can't run a marathon in sub 4 hours unless I train and practice and do my work. So I think organizations do their work and they get the reward. And so I think there are lots of talented women. We're seeing them. I think one of the reasons why the board statistics are improving more quickly is because it's easier, right? There's, a board of 20 people. Okay, so we want 6 females at a minimum on our board. 6 females. Okay, that's recruitable.
Well, if you do, in politics, if you do have those numbers, do you find that the public might question why that person is there if they've earned their position?
Well, I think the research suggests that voters on average tend to be positively inclined towards women candidates. It's when we get to women leaders that some of the problems kick in, because then we're dealing with a smaller recruitment pool. It's not we as voters who are generally choosing party leaders, it's parties themselves. Right, and so it's a different selectorate, of choice makers. I also think that there's the reality that in political parties and in party leadership, this issue of retention is often in the hands of the voters, right? And there may be opinion leaders within parties, opinion leaders within the media who may be very uncomfortable with women in positions of leadership, right? And that is often, we find, what is pushing some women off the stage, including ones who, by many metrics, have been extremely successful.
Well,
right. So that's a problem that's rather different, I would say, than in a corporate environment, because we do have in a democratic political system the ability for voters and insiders and journalists and all kinds of people to comment on what constitutes leadership.
Well, what constitutes leadership? Is it are women different from leading than men are? Like, what constitutes a difference?
Well, I think in terms of the premiers that we've had, for the most part, we're finding, for example, that the assumption that the tenor of legislative debate would change when women take over is really not held. It's not supported by the evidence. In part because the practices within these institutions have unfolded over so many decades, over so many generations, that it's very hard to argue that if a woman becomes, let's say, a premier or a leader of a political party, that she herself is going to change somehow the sort of conflict-oriented, cutting out the floor from under one's opponents in 10 seconds, that she's going to change that culture. So in response to the question that the book poses about doing politics differently, we're finding that some women premiers are recruiting a lot of other women as candidates, but some, for example, are not. Some are doing a lot in terms of moving policies forward that women have historically cared a great deal about, such as childcare and pay equity. But on the question of the tenor of political debate, there's very little change. And so that, I think, is important to look at, because we often believe that a successful political leader is someone who excels at the art of succeeding in an institution that is really built around conflict and not so much around consensus. And in fact, some of the research shows that there is more conflict in legislatures when there are women party leaders than when there are men. If you want to measure it by things like heckling, ejections from the legislature, the use of time allocation or closure measures. I mean, there is some evidence that maybe because of the challenges that are posed to these women leaders to prove themselves as leaders in the old way,
To become louder?
that and so the recruitment practices are ones which obviously ensure that those who get to the pinnacle of the organization are excelling according to the norms that the organization has traditionally valued.
And what about party? Does that make a difference?
Party certainly makes a difference in the sense that the women who are most likely, for example, to move issues forward on childcare and pay equity and so on, tend to come from the center left or left of the political spectrum, which is consistent with what we find for men leaders, right? That tends to be associated with more government intervention, more public spending, which is usually associated with the progressive part of the political spectrum. We're finding that there are some women leaders who, for example, in the case of Alison Redford, our colleague Clark Bannock at the University of Alberta shows in his chapter that there's evidence that Redford was not that comfortable with other leaders who were women. She didn't recruit too many women in her bureaucracy or in her cabinet, and that perhaps she was a case of a queen bee, a woman who was quite uncomfortable with other women and who wanted to be the only woman in the room with the guys.
And Colleen, in many situations, we've seen that even when there are steps to recruit women, women don't choose the leadership path. Why is that?
Well, I don't know if I actually agree with that. Like, I think the book shares 70 stories of 70 Canadian business leaders, mostly in the Toronto market, who shop at your grocery store and are on your soccer field and demonstrate characteristics that we think are value-based leadership characteristics. And I think they chose that pathway. So I actually think there are more and more women who are putting their hands up.
So why do we think that women aren't putting up their hands?
So I think if your organization is the place where you have to make a choice between work and your home, women live a far more inclusive style of work life. They choose to live them both, and they
Is it a
blend.
choice? Is it a choice?
You choose your blend, and you choose how you live. Like in the book, one of the women talks about blue sparkle on her suit. We've all had spit upon our suits, right? You just that's it. You just go for it. And so I think the realistic part of life is some of it does get moved together, and I think today's world lets you do that. And women are excelling.
And you also need the support of your company, right? Because if you have to leave early or have to pick up the kids.
Yeah, you need support of your company. You need support of your family. You need support of your kids. You need support in your, your extended family. We get to the end of the line bringing a lot of people with us. And I think organizations are more human and accept that that's how they'll get the best. And best in everyone, not just their leaders.
Let's talk about the F word. Failure. Is this something that we need to talk about more? Because when it comes to politics, in the situations that you put out in the book, sometimes the women who do become premiers are inheriting, some really bad stuff. And then when they don't do well, it's their fault. And that says what about women leaders? I think they have that burden on them. Do we need to talk more about failure?
Well, I think, we've tried in this book to focus on these women premiers and sort of set up a set of categories to help us to understand the conditions under which they became premiers. So we certainly talk about what we call imperiled leadership, where a woman takes over a political party and a government which appears to be really on the ropes.
And you also call it a glass cliff, right?
Well, we refer to the glass cliff argument because we say we want to give it a little more texture, right? Because these cliffs vary, right? Some of them seem to be doomed, but a lot of these women save their parties and win, a majority government for a party that's considered doomed under the previous male leader, right? Then we have these women who are pioneers, who bring a party to power that's never been in office before. And despite their huge breakthroughs, they still get a very, very rough ride. Rachel Notley would be the most recent example of that. And then we have these women that we call empowered, a woman who takes over a political party that's in power, that's doing very well from a male leader who's big and charismatic, and she's found wanting in many cases because no woman can project that kind of ego and charisma, as for example, Catherine Kalbeck found in Prince Edward Island, succeeding Joe Giz, or Kathy Dunderdale in Newfoundland succeeding Danny Williams. So there are different kinds of cliffs here, but our argument really is that we need to unpack these circumstances and talk about what it was, if we talk about these cliffs, what is it that tips this woman off the edge, off the stage? And in many cases, it's the impatience of her own political party, despite the fact that she's made an incredible breakthrough in many cases by saving them from certain oblivion.
So do you think more women need to put up their hands when it comes to politics?
Well, I think it's very important for us to have a democratic political process that offers us leaders who look like ourselves as a society. So I think it's very important to have diverse political leadership. I think it's very important for us to question the circumstances that face our leaders and what it is that may prevent people from putting themselves forward because the obstacles and the threats may seem to be so impossible to navigate.
And Colleen, what role does mentorship and sponsorship play?
Well, I actually want to go back to the F word, okay? Because I think one of the reasons why we felt that we needed, we did the Judy Project, and then there was 450 women who went on that, and we wanted to amplify our impact, right? Because for women leaders in corporations, we want impact. We want to change our companies, we want to change our world. So I think one of the things that we felt is corporate storytelling is one of the ways you do it. And you talked about the F word, and in the chapter on courage, Beth says, I failed, but I'm not a failure. And actually talking about it honestly or sharing stories honestly allows people to work it around in their mouth and in their minds and say, yeah, you know, I can go for that. The worst thing would happen is I might fail. That won't make me a failure. I think often, and you know, I'm not in the realm of politics, but leadership isn't a soundbite. You know, it isn't a moment. It's a long period of time of a bunch of activities that demonstrate leadership. And I think that when we use storytelling, younger women, and that's who the book's written for, can learn. And it reminds all of us as older women to pull women up, to bring them along, which is where mentorship and sponsorship comes in. Sponsorship, I'm going to talk about you when you're not in the room. I'm going to represent you when you're not in the room. Mentorship is more of a two-way street. You know, how do you feel about that, Colleen? Has that ever happened to you? I'm thinking about having a child. When do I tell, you know, my boss? So being able to, mentorship is about, well, here's how you might frame that. So it's pulling up and also staying in with that woman as she evolves her own voice.
And Sylvia, I'll let you have the last word.
Sure. I think we've seen a tremendous amount of mentorship on the part of women in Canadian public life. I think one of the surprising findings of this study is that we've had some political women on the right and the center right, outside the part of the spectrum where we expect this to happen, who've actually done a lot to recruit women cabinet ministers and recruit women in the senior reaches of the bureaucracies. So I think the mentorship and the sponsorship and the encouragement of other women is something that can happen across the spectrum. And I think that's one of the very encouraging parts of Canadian politics, because it's rare to see a political system where conservative women are prepared to actually work to increase numbers across the board in a spectrum where they can do so.
Well, Sylvia and Colleen, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for the work that you do to empower women. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.